Hello and thank you for watching the Angry Rooster Creations channel. Today we are taking a look at another fountain pen ink in this video. This here is Noodler's Lexington Gray. This is one of Noodler's bulletproof line of inks. It is an ink that is supposed to be waterproof, is supposed to be light fast, it is supposed to essentially be an archival quality ink. As the name suggests, this is a gray ink. Now, I generally am somebody who uses my inks for drawing and art in my pens, and so I have a preference towards inks that are in that light, fast, and eternal kind of, archival type of category. And so the papers that I'm going to be using in this video to test this ink are mostly in line with my use of fountain pens. So I have two papers that are sort of a control. I'm going to be writing on a 20-pound Pen Gear copy paper, which is the cheapest copy paper that you can get at Walmart. I have a Pen Gear composition notebook. And then for the art papers, I have a 50-pound Blick white sulfite drawing paper, a 50-pound Koh-i-Noor sketch paper, and a 98-pound Canson mixed media paper. And then once I'm done with that, I have a little chromatography strip that I'm going to show, which I did, and then I'm going to do a real quick water resistance test. So first we're going to do the writing test on the 20-pound copy paper. And here is the 20-pound copy paper. My pen that I'm using for this ink test today is this Hongdian M2 in brass that has a extra fine nib. All right. So now I can tell you from just in the writing, you can kind of see this ink sort of grew on the paper quite a bit. It really aggressively wicked into it. So even though this isn't extra fine on this copy paper, this is writing. I mean, in some cases, I would almost say it's writing a lot more bold, almost somewhere between a fine and a medium, if I'm based on some of the pens that I've written with. It is definitely beyond the realm of a typical extra fine, even a Western extra fine, which is kind of what this pen tends to write like. It tends to write like a Western extra fine on a not so absorbent paper. Now on my 10-second smear test, I was not able to get any of this to smear. This ink is pretty much wicking directly into the paper as soon as it goes down. And I couldn't get the scrub that I did here to smear either, and I tried to smear the scrub almost immediately. So, yeah, usually on a lot of these Noodler's inks that are listed as bulletproof, they tend to be pretty fast drying inks. It's not 100% the case, but on a lot of these bulletproof inks, they're pretty fast drying. Now on the back here, this is just copy paper. So, copy paper is about one of the worst papers you can choose to use a fountain pen on, and as you can see here, it does bleed through pretty considerably. I don't think this is to the point that if I had another sheet underneath this one that it would have bled completely through. But between the ghosting and the bleeds that I can see here, I would not consider using the back side of a piece of paper, a piece of copy paper, if you had to write on it with this ink. So if you were looking at potentially having to write on a piece of copy paper with Lexington Gray, you're really only going to want to do that, or if you have to do that, you want to only do that in a situation where you're not going to be needing both sides of the paper. And one thing, I don't think I really mentioned it, on the front side, although this did grow on the paper pretty significantly, I can also say there's not really much in the way of feathering. So it grew quite a bit, but it didn't really feather. Maybe there's a couple spots at the end of things like that T there that might have possibly, you could say, feathered a bit, but generally speaking, it's just that it pretty aggressively wicked into that paper and kind of grew on it. So not the worst, but it's not necessarily an ink that I would elect to use on copy paper. I have other inks that I would rather use in this situation. So with that being said, our next test is going to be in the Pen Gear notebook. And now here we are looking at the writing in the Pen Gear composition notebook. Alright, so there's the Pen Gear composition notebook. I can say from looking at this that I did get a little bit of a smear, but even still, looks like it only smeared within the first second or two. Or it was dry within a second or two. It looks like on the 10-second smear there, only that last line actually seems to have smeared. Now once again, this seems to have grown and gotten kind of woolly on this paper to the point that it kind of makes the lines a bit busy. This is a college ruled notebook, and for anybody that maybe isn't here in the States and maybe perhaps college rule doesn't mean anything to you, that would be a 7mm ruling. Or roughly a 7mm ruling, and the way, even with this extra fine nib, the way this is kind of grown in the lines, just that alone, I said I would consider to not make this the best ink to use in a cheap notebook like this. Once again, it doesn't really have feathering, it's just that it got real woolly and really kind of wicked into that paper pretty seriously. Now let's see what the back looks like. Looks like on my scratch sheet here, I don't know if that's even going to show up. Looks like I got a little spot there where perhaps I got a little bleed through on the scrub. Other than that, nothing really bled through onto the other, what would have been the paper on the back side, but you can see that there are some bleeds and some ghosting going on. I wouldn't say it's the worst. You could use the back side of this paper if, for instance, you were pretty quick with your writing and you didn't let the nib sit on the paper in any one particular spot. I think you could probably mitigate the bleeding, but if you are kind of slower and more deliberate in your writing, you would probably have more issues with this ink bleeding through the paper. So for use in a notebook like this, this is probably not the ink that you would want to use. But then again, this isn't necessarily the kind of notebook that you would want to use for fountain pens anyways. Now, our next paper that we're going to do will be the Blick 50-pound white sulfite drawing paper. And so now here we are with the Blick white sulfite drawing paper. Alright, and there is the white sulfite drawing paper. Now, of the 3 art papers I'm going to be using, this is the most absorbent of the art papers. So, but as far as that goes, it did not wick as bad. You can see that these lines are more in line with being an extra fine. I would say that probably on the next two papers we'll see a line weight that'll actually still be slightly thinner than this, because this is a little on the thicker side for an extra fine. But like I said, this paper still, it's semi-absorbent. Now, starting with this paper, I think I can kind of maybe see some hints of shading. Not a lot. Just enough that I'm starting to question whether I might actually be seeing some shading or not. I feel like maybe that T in Lexington on the cursive writing there, I don't know how this is going to show up on the on camera here. There's a couple places where I feel like I could maybe see some hints of shading. Once again, this seemed to have dried in really fast. I'm looking at the smear. There may have been maybe the third or fourth mark might be some hints that it wanted to start. But really, the only one I can see definitively that smeared is that last mark. So that's like, you know, maybe 1 second to dry, and I did get the scrub to smear, obviously. That was the immediate. On the back side here, now keep in mind this is a 50-pound paper. There's a couple spots where it has ghosted on this 50-pound paper, but not terrible. Certainly would be usable. That being said, this is an art paper. It's meant for more for drawing, and usually you only do your art on one side of the paper because that art would generally be displayed to some degree, and so you wouldn't see the backside or use the backside. Also, because if you're doing art on both sides, you would potentially disrupt an already completed art piece. But that being said, if perhaps you have a heavier weight paper that's not necessarily an art paper that you need to write on for some reason, you look like you would probably be okay. So, that being said, that's it for this paper. We're going to now move on to the 50-pound Koh-i-Noor sketch paper. And now here we are with the 50-pound Koh-i-Noor sketch paper. Alright, and that's got us done with the Koh-i-Noor sketch paper. Now, this paper is not absorbent whatsoever. Okay, no, that is dry. Thought that little dot there was going to still be wet. So this paper is not really absorbent at all. I can see some spots where I thought maybe it was still a little wet, but it actually looks like it's shading some on this paper. So certain of the letters, well, that actually was still wet there. How about that? So dry time is a little bit longer on this paper because it's not aggressive and not able to wick into the paper. You can see that smear on all 10 hash marks. So 10 seconds it was clearly still wet. Smear was pretty wet. So we have some shading on this paper, and like I said, it's that EF there, that was probably a 20 seconds and it was still some wetness there. There's a couple of places where I go on dots and things where that that ink seemed to really want to puddle on the paper. I feel like part of that is this ink seems to be pretty wet flowing ink, especially with that scrub smear. It's just that on some of the other papers it was pretty aggressively wicking into the paper, so there wasn't a lot there to smear. But then you get to a paper like this where it's not able to just really aggressively wick up into the fiber of the paper, and it seems to be a fairly wet flowing ink. Now this paper, it doesn't have any kind of, this is really more of a proper extra, what I would expect to see from an extra fine nib as far as line weight. There is no feathering, it's not woolly, It's not growing on the page, not doing anything funky here. It's actually reacting more like how you would expect ink to react, or how you would prefer ink to react on the paper, which doesn't surprise me knowing this paper being non-absorbent. On the back side, it did not bleed or ghost or anything. Now this paper, it is a 50-pound paper, but it almost feels like a parchment paper. It's very thin for a 50-pound paper. It has to do with the actual formulation of the paper itself, and it is, generally speaking, pretty resistant to the negative effects that you would usually attribute to inks, and that's kind of inks of all kinds. So this paper, generally speaking, handles ink quite well. So I'm not really surprised by anything I see here. Most of the inks I have used on this so far have not had any issues on this. It's one of the more ink tolerant papers that I have. So that's the Koh-i-Noor sketch paper. Next we're going to move on to the Canson mixed media paper. And now for our last paper here. This is the 98-pound Canson mixed media paper. I had to hit that 10-second smear twice because the first time I missed most of the line. But it didn't matter because it was wet both times. So this mixed media paper is not a very absorbent paper. So as you can see, we were still wet at 10 seconds. And in fact, still wet beyond 10 seconds. Anywhere that this ink has kind of went down pretty wet off that nib, it's still got some dry, for the most part it's dry. I would say 98% of the ink, probably somewhere in that vicinity, is dry, but on a couple of spots, like when I dotting eyes specifically, there's still a little bit of wetness. Now, there does appear to be some shading, not a whole lot, but there's some places I can see that have definitely shaded and are slightly darker. Generally speaking, towards the end of the pen strokes. But no feathering, no funky stuff, generally speaking. And this is also definitely, at this point, 100% that's an extra fine line. So the ink isn't growing on the page or doing anything like that, which I wouldn't expect, not with this mixed media paper. It's generally meant to handle pretty much anything you can throw at it. Wet media and dry media, which includes things like ink like this, India ink, alcohol inks, some watercolors. It's not a true watercolor paper, but it can handle some pretty aggressive wet media, acrylics, and those kinds of things. So it doesn't surprise me that this ink behaves quite well on this paper. So far, every ink that I've put on this type of paper has done well. And there is nothing on the back side. You can't even tell that anything's on the opposite side of this, but this 98-pound paper, if you can hear, is about the same thickness that you would attribute to a cardstock. So you shouldn't expect to see anything bleed through this paper, especially considering that it's not an absorbent paper. So what I see here does not surprise me in the least. But for as far as, like I said, with that shading, if there was a paper that's going to show that off, this is going to be the paper. And like I said, there's some there, but it's not heavy. Now, maybe if you had a broader nib, you might see more, but with this particular extra fine that I'm using today, that's about the extent of it right there. And now we're going to take a look at my little poor man's chromatography. This here is a piece of a paper towel, which is not the best filter paper to use for a chromatography, but it's the filter paper that I have. This, if I can keep it from being too washed out here, adjust my light. As you can see, I put a line of ink on this paper. and then I dipped it into a solution of a mixture of 70% isopropyl alcohol mixed at about 30% in with water, and dipped this ink into, dipped it in to that solution, allowed it to wick up the paper. Now I'm trying to turn my lights away here because my lights are sort of washing this out. This is very faint. That Lexington gray went down and pretty much bonded very extreme to the paper, like it really set in there and didn't really want to hardly move. I'm trying to keep this from getting washed out because what did travel up the page is very faint, and here the exposure of the camera is not wanting to capture it. But there is a gray that has moved up the page, but in that gray there are some, I don't know if that's going to show, I feel like it can up in here. I don't know how true the colors are going to show. You can kind of see some little, almost like little tick marks in that kind of gray there. They're blue. There is a blue component to this ink that has traveled up the page in that light gray. I don't know if you could see that. Like I said, I had to turn the lights away because the colors were washing out and it wouldn't even pick up on the camera, but I don't know how true that's going to show through in the end video. But there is some blue in this, so this is more of this is not a warm gray, it's a cool gray. So generally, I guess if you hear that term and don't understand what that means, usually a warm gray is a gray that has as far as the color spectrum, is sort of based in has brownish or kind of reddish, yellowish hues. And a cool gray is going to be a gray that has sort of a bluish, a slate, or maybe even teal hues to it, as far as how you go from black to gray. So this being sort of a bluish based gray would make this a cool gray. But, for the most part, when you're writing with it, you won't necessarily notice that. Most of the time you'll see the difference between a cool gray and a warm gray is if you're doing a big swatch. But in the writing, if you're just writing words and letters and things, especially with something like the extra fine nib, you may not notice that, but you can see it here in the chromatography. So like I said, not necessarily the best paper. If I had more proper filter paper, you'd probably see more of those different colors and things in here, but for what it's worth, there's the chromatography we have at home. And for our last test here, we are going to do a quick water resistance test. This is a little piece of 20-pound copy paper. I'm going to draw a grid on here. I'm going to leave it for 30 seconds, and then I'm going to take a pipette with some water, drip the water on there, leave that water for 10 seconds. I'm going to then rub it in with my finger and dab it off with this strip of paper towel, and we're going to see if any ink lifts onto the paper towel or if any ink runs or bleeds onto the paper. Alright, so I kind of tried to get up in here and fix my lighting a bit. Now, it's hard to tell. I don't really think anything moved on here. I say I don't think because the problem with something like, in some cases with black, but especially with this gray, when you put water on there, naturally you're going to see sort of a grayish cast to the parts of the paper. Like a hue is going to change on the parts of the paper that's going to kind of get that grayish sort of shadow just from the paper itself being wet. So unless a large quantity of that ink actually moves onto the paper, that's clearly visible, it's hard to tell if, a small amount has moved. But I really think that in this situation, nothing really did move. I don't see anything that indicates there's any gray ink on the towel here. And considering how aggressively this ink wicked into the copy paper and the initial writing test, and how quickly it dried on the copy paper, leads me to suspect that this it once it bonds into the paper, it seems that this is pretty well permanent, or pretty well water resistant. Now, as far as the paper itself, the fiber of the paper has actually started to lift. Had I continued rubbing this, the paper would have probably started to fall apart. So, you can't see that, but I can feel the fibers of the paper lifting. Actually, I can see one. I don't know if that's going to show up, but right there, no, it's not going to show up on camera. But there are some paper fibers already lifting. So, as far as water resistance, this appears to be very water resistant. Now, on some of the other papers where it was still wet, obviously if the ink's still wet, when you drip water on it, it's going to wash off. But it appears that once it's dried on the paper, it's pretty well there. So, with all that being said, on the ink itself, I think on the lesser, like the less fountain pen friendly papers, the more absorbent papers, it seems like it has a tendency to grow and sort of swell on the page. It doesn't really feather, but it gets kind of woolly. So if you were forced to use this ink, if you were looking at maybe having to use this ink on a less fountain pen friendly paper, I would suggest probably using a rather dry writing extra fine. Like I said, I think this maybe even been a little wet flowing in this particular pen, more so than maybe some others extra fines. But if you're using a proper fountain pen paper, something that's more ink friendly, I think it's probably, you could use perhaps whatever you want. There might be the case, like I said, I used this extra fine here. There were some slight hints of shading, so maybe if you used a wetter medium nib on a non-absorbent paper, you might actually see some shading. But with this extra fine, I just had some slight hints that there might be shading capable in this ink. But other than that, it does have an interesting color to it. Now, I have written on some other paper, like on my sketchbook, I've done a few little sketches with this ink, and it actually looked a little lighter on that paper than it did on these test papers just now. And in some cases, I have had this where in my sketchbook, it almost looked like almost the color of pencil lead. And this test so far on the papers I just did today, it was a little bit darker than that. But and I think it's more apparent when you have black ink on the page to contrast with it. But it does have a pretty sort of unique color as far as inks that I've used. And for artistic purposes, for drawing and things like I use, it adds an interesting color and an interesting option to drawing. And if you're going to, say for instance, if I wanted to brush with this, you can use this in a brush capacity to do some grayscaling in art, rather than necessarily taking, like, say, a black ink and watering it down to get a gray. You have an ink that already is gray. Because depending on what you're doing, watering down a black ink to get a gray wash, depending on the paper you're using, while it can work visually, it can also cause buckling and weird things to happen with the paper if it's not necessarily a paper that tolerates that very well. Things other than, say, for instance, watercolor papers. So there are some things about having a gray, like an actual gray ink, that for artistic purposes is really nice. As far as using this as an everyday ink, I think, like I said, if you don't have the most say in the option of paper that you're going to be using, just due to the way this kind of aggressively wanted to get into some of the papers and grow, I would say a drier fine. And personally myself, I probably would not carry this as an everyday daily ink for, potentially use in all situations. I think it's a little bit more situational than that. It needs a paper that is more tolerant for ink. So, having said all that, there's the video. I hope those of you that watched it, especially if you watched it to this point in the video, were informed by it. You maybe got some information that you can use. And if you thought it was informative and you enjoyed the video, thought I did a decent job with the way I tried to present the test, it really helped me out. If you could, drop a like down there, that would really help me out. And if there was any questions or critiques or, any kind of comments that you have about the ink or the way that I did things in the video, in the test, you can drop that down there in the comment section. At this point, I don't get a whole lot of comments, so usually I try to read, well, I do read everything, and I usually try to, reply back to most of the comments that I get. And, if you watch this video and you watch some of my other videos and you kind of like the way that I make my videos, like the way that I present the information in the videos, and you think I'm doing a pretty, decent job, I'd appreciate a subscription. That would also really help me out in the channel. And one more thing before I go, I will mention that on these papers that I am testing, that I did the ink test on, I have a few more places, on this paper for other inks. So I've got 4 more inks that I'm going to do. When this is done, I am going to do a light fastness test with these papers. I'm going to take the Canson, the Koh-i-Noor, and the Blick papers, and I'm going to tape them up in a window on the south side of my house in direct view of the sun and leave them up for a month so that I can come back after a month's time and compare them to the copy paper, which will be my control, which will stay inside and not be exposed to sunlight, and also with the actual pen to write a new sample on one of the papers that's been exposed to the sun to see what kind of fading may occur with the various inks on these papers after being exposed to direct sunlight for, a month. I already did this once. That video is already up on the channel. I tested some of the Noodler's Polar inks, Legal Blue, Bad Blue Heron, and the Noodler's Bay State Concord Grape. And in the initial test, the inks that were said to be eternal, so the Polar's inks, the Bad Blue Heron, the Legal Blue, all pretty much passed the light fastness test with flying colors. The Bay State Concord Grape here was a wild card, and it ended up almost completely disappearing from the paper. So this time around, the more permanent inks, for the most part, I have already done. I have a few other inks that I got in ink samples that I'm not entirely sure on their properties. So some of the other inks that I have on here, and one of the inks that I already have on here right now, are kind of a little up in the air about what they will do. Whereas this Lexington Gray and the Noodler's Heart of Darkness that's already on this sheet, I expect to pass with flying colors and not really see any fading, because these two here are advertised as being bulletproof and eternal. So anyways, that's another video that you can look forward to that will be coming up in the future. But that does it for this one. So I thank you for watching, and I hope to catch you on the next one. Bye.